Hi, Mickey.
Hey, Bob. How are you?
Good. How you doing?
I'm okay. I'm feeling clean and articulate.
Well, that sounds like the regular Mickey.
Actually, I'm not feeling clean and articulate.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
I went to a, and I've lost my Joel Stein here. I went to a glamorous Hollywood party last night and was seated across from Linda Gray, the former star of Dallas.
Wow, that sounds vaguely familiar.
What do you mean?
I mean, the name Linda Gray. I remember what the show Dallas was.
I figured maybe she was a huge crush of yours, but I guess not.
Don't know her.
Okay. Never mind.
And besides, I'm having a little trouble hearing you, so I wouldn't respond even if I did. But you know, Mickey, there's good news on the viral marketing front.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, you know the website Facebook that where people younger than us go and do things we don't totally understand?
I've heard of it.
Yeah. Well, somebody started a blogging heads group on it, and listen to this. As of 2 weeks ago, there was one member of the group, presumably the founder, whom we should someday glorify, I guess. And now, 2 weeks later, there are 21 members, okay? And, you know, if you do the math, I don't have a calculator, but I think if present trends continue, and every 2 weeks the membership grows by a factor of 21, I believe that all of humanity will be evincing enthusiasm for Blogging Heads TV by the end of the year.
We'll be colonizing planets in the year 2009.
My point exactly. And they say we don't have a business model, Mickey.
Okay, well that's...
So we'll link to that. We'll link to the that site that you and I would not know how to orient ourselves in, but some people will.
Cool.
So what are we going to talk about?
I think we're starting with Iraq, as usual.
As often we do.
The news from Iraq seems to be that Maliki is having trouble producing the troops that he's required to produce under the surge plan.
Oh, so he's failing to meet a benchmark?
He's failing to meet a benchmark. Well, he hasn't failed yet, but he gave a sort of, not desperate, but he gave a speech on national television where he sort of tried to rouse the generals in the outlying provinces to send the troops they promised. And,
wait, he's using TV to try to get the generals to produce the troops?
That seems to be what was happening.
That's not a good sign.
He might also have been trying to reassure the population that he realized that that they were annoyed that the troops hadn't materialized already, and that in the meantime, people in Baghdad were being killed by car bombs. So he was obviously in part directed at the public, but he also actually seemed to be trying to put pressure on whoever was commanding these troops to produce them. Public pressure. It's not crazy. I mean, he basically was saying, you know, people will, you know, it's no more time for dawdling. But it does sort of dovetail with the Edward Luttwak piece that you
that I directed you to.
Directed me to.
I should say first that some people say that Bush wants him not to meet the benchmark so that they can dump him in favor of, I think, some Sistani surrogate or something. But that's the John Burns theory, that the Bush administration wouldn't especially mind if he failed to meet the benchmarks.
A Sistani surrogate? Who is a Sistani surrogate? I thought they were all pay deference to Sistani.
Well, Sistani tries to, you know, transcend the intra-sectarian differences,
right.
But supposedly this is a guy more closely associated with him than the present government. But I don't know. I could have that part totally wrong. Anyway, John Burns' theory is that when, part of the whole, when the surge plan came out, the idea was, part of it was that if he failed to meet the benchmarks, we would find a way to use that as a pretext for easing him out of the picture.
But that was a few weeks ago, an eternity in Iraqi time.
Right, and now he's failing to meet the benchmarks.
Oh,
but yeah, there were these two pieces. I mean, you would, to follow the kind of public debate, you'd think that the options are surge or total withdrawal, because in kind of partisan terms, those are the things being most talked about. But there are these alternatives that are being written about.
Right, and Gates has said that, you know, surge isn't our last option. So presumably some of these are the options he's thinking of. Secretary of Defense Gates, not Bill Gates. It makes sense to me. You know, the interesting thing about basically Luttwak makes the point that if we withdraw to to basically, we reduce our troops and disengage and let the Iraqis settle the security themselves, that forces them to take responsibility in a way that they haven't before, and there'll be some violence, but it might not spiral out of control. It's basically
it's the kind of
his
the
point.
kind of hockey ref approach. I mean, I haven't watched hockey in a long time, but it used to be that sometimes when a fight broke out, the referees would just kind of cordon it off and let them fight for a while. And then when they got exhausted, they would step in and break it up. And there's some of that, because the plan is our troops would assume like a kind of just standoff positions, get out of urban areas more or less, to some extent cluster along the border in an attempt to stop at least some shipments of materials across the border into the war zone. And he concedes that there would be some ethnic cleansing, but thinks that there would also, over time, be some negotiation as they took responsibility for their fate, as you said, and they would work things out, and stability would ultimately ensue at least as fast as it would otherwise.
This is sort of the small-scale version of the Thomas Friedman withdrawal option, which is basically that all the countries in the region would have to take responsibility for the Sunni-Shiite conflict, and this is sort of that writ small. With the O'Hanlon piece that you also directed me to, the hope that it
that's in the American interest, right?
Yeah, that it holds out is that you don't have to partition the whole country into 3 homogeneous areas in order to achieve a stable solution. In Bosnia, there were these sort of little micro-enclaves that were carved out in a very complicated pattern, and that somehow proved to be stable at least once the Serbs had basically seized enough territory to feel secure. And that the UN, in Bosnia actually assisted the migration, assisted the ethnic cleansing.
Right, there were peaceful population transfers as an alternative to ethnic cleansing.
Right, and that's a sort of logical, that's the sort of David Brooks model of the surge, which is we don't just try to attempt to sort of impose order, but we actually attempt to assist ethnic segregation.
Right.
And that's always appealed to me. And the other appeal I think about the O'Hanlon plan is that it says, this doesn't have to be permanent, that once you have this sort of Bosnia-like situation, eventually an Iraqi state could emerge as people trade and do various Bob Righty, Nonzero sum things with each other. So it's all very optimistic. I must admit I don't know enough about Iraq to know if it is workable. If you look at the map of Baghdad, I go both ways on it.
Well, you're right. It is kind of a more fine-grained elaboration of the approach David Brooks seems to be advocating, and that I've expressed some sympathy for, which is a kind of, facilitate partition by finding a nonviolent form of population transfer. But I've got to say, when they draw it out in this kind of detail, you start to see some of the problems. I mean, in particular, they note that, look, the Sunnis are never going to buy into this if there's not a mechanism for, dividing the oil funds, and meanwhile, the Kurds want, they're going to insist on Kurdish settlement of Kirkuk, this oil-rich area on the borderline between Arab and Kurdish areas.
There he thinks you could have an oil for people swap. So
right, but the problem with that, here's the sentence. U.S. pressure on the Kurds could encourage them to cut a deal on Kirkuk's oil while earning greater Sunni cooperation on property swaps in the town. Now ask yourself, if you're a Sunni, are you going to trust that any deal is actually going to be followed through on? The problem is there's no authority in Iraq that anyone any longer trusts to enforce deals. The Sunnis certainly don't trust the present government. If they're paying attention to the political climate in America, they're not going to trust that American troops are going to be there long enough to enforce some deal years and years from now. And it seems to me the problem with the scenario they sketched out, and a huge part of the problem we face at this point, is that there's no authority that anyone trusts anymore that transcends all of Iraq.
what was the authority in Bosnia?
Well, I wondered about that, but I have the vague idea that there was more of an authority. I don't know whether it was the United Nations. I mean, certainly you were not seeing the kind of fine-grained sectarian violence and civil war that you're seeing in Iraq. I have the vague recollection that although there were, massive brutalities committed and massive atrocities in particular cases, it was not nearly the chaotic system that Iraq was. But it's a good question. What was the source of the trust? And I think maybe, actually, it could have been the UN, which is something I'd like to believe.
I think it was pretty brutal. Isn't the source that isn't the source our bombers, NATO bombers? That's what brought the Serbs around, right?
The bombers mattered because there was already more separation of population, I think, than there is now, and that made it easier to strike targets, probably.
Also, there was an obvious Serb capital city with a built-up industrial base.
Right.
And we could bomb it.
Right.
And I don't think there is such a thing.
I think the point is the more you inspect the precedent they're using, which is Bosnia, the less faith you will put in their solution.
But and maybe it's just that the Sunnis have a very bad hand to play. I mean,
they do.
I mean, so there's a limit to the extent to which you're going to be able to reassure the Sunnis.
Yeah.
And if American troops are leaving, and American troops are what's protecting the Sunnis, it seems to me that that's a good reason for them to cut a deal now, before we leave. No.
Yeah, but again, if you can get them to trust that the deal will be followed. I should also say I've heard it, I genuinely don't know what we should do. I'm not yet prepared to embrace actual withdrawal, but I have heard a couple of things that lend credence to the withdrawal side of the argument lately. One of them is something John Burns said on Charlie Rose a week or two ago, which is just that right now, he thinks you're actually getting a lot of cooperation between Sunni Baathists and Sunni jihadists. But once they have, are left to their own devices, once the fighting with the Shiites and with us is over, he thinks the Baathists are going to expel the jihadists. And if that's true, that takes a little of the force out of one of the arguments against withdrawal, which is that the Sunni region will become a haven for terrorists. I mean, it may or may not be, and the Baathists may or may not decide that they have some use for terrorism, but he seems to think the jihadists are going to be given the heave-ho in the end, which is not in itself good news because they'll go somewhere, but it does suggest that the Sunni region might not become what Afghanistan was, right before 9/11.
Well, it's a big region. I mean, all Al-Qaeda needs is one base somewhere. That's the problem.
Yeah, but it's also not a region where it's easy to have an inconspicuous base. I mean, I think the Baathists will know where the bases are, and if they want them gone, they'll be gone, is the theory.
If we know where the bases are, we can destroy them.
Yeah, the other thing is that, there's this piece in the New York Times about how Saudi Arabia is kind of stepping up and working harder to, steer the region toward a kind of stability to its liking. In light of the failure of the United States to do that,
right, that's the well. First, how does Saudi Arabia influence the region in a way that reassures the Sunnis? I mean, where is the military might of Saudi Arabia? I don't think.
Well, they have a lot of money.
They have a lot of money, but they don't have a lot of military power, and the only way they can exert military power is by sending all these jihadists in to defend the Sunnis.
I would not say that. I mean, these Baathists know how to kill people. In fact, one thing Juan Cole said a long time ago was that even though the Baathists are outnumbered by the Shiites, they have such tremendous expertise in the use of weaponry and in logistics and planning and so on, that he would not bet against them in an out-and-out war with the Shiites. So I think if you add Sunni or Saudi money to the Baathists in Iraq, you would probably have Baathists who could defend, have Sunnis, Baathist Sunnis who could defend their territory against further Shiite incursions.
So we have the Shiites in Baghdad who seem quite confident that they can make the minority lose, and we have Sunnis who are quite confident in their ability to kill people. This makes the Lushvak funded by Saudi Arabia. This makes the Lushvak hockey ref solution seem wildly unappealing, and a recipe for an actual war until these parties come to their senses.
Well, I think he would admit candidly that there will, as for Baghdad, a whole bunch of Sunnis are about to leave. A lot already have left, and he might admit that that's going to go to its logical conclusion before you get serious negotiations. He's not all that specific about that.
Well, right, but in the meantime, the Sunnis are setting off massive car bombs that nobody can go shopping because their market's going to be blown to smithereens.
Yeah, but that's because they think Baghdad is still, in dispute. I mean, once its possession is clearly Shiite, and the Sunnis feel they have a defensible region, then negotiations might begin. I don't know. This is what I take his argument to be.
If these are two possible alternatives, one is the Luftwaffe disengagement, and the second is the O'Hanlon engage and assist in ethnic population transfer. The second one, after what you've told me, seems wildly more appealing.
If it works, but we've talked about some of the practical problems.
Right, but the Luftwaffe solution is basically let several 100,000 people die.
It has its cold-blooded aspect, but I think he'd say, look, that's where we're headed one way or another. There's no easy solution, but I don't know.
Seems to me you've got to give O'Hanlon a try. And the second thing is the O'Hanlon solution doesn't involve Baghdad becoming a Shiite city. And is that the only way to have a Bosnia solution, is to have Baghdad be entirely Shiite? I don't think they're conceding that at all. Are they?
I don't know whether he envisions moving all the Sunnis out of Baghdad.
But if you look at a map, there's sort of, if you move this one neighborhood across the river, then the river becomes a dividing line, and,
Oh, is it that simple?
It's not that simple, but you move two neighborhoods and move one. It's not.
But if it's
it's not a complete checkerboard. It's not a total checkerboard. The last map.
But the balance of power is clear in the two areas.
Yes, but it's not close to being a Shiite city.
Right.
I mean, it's like you're talking the movement of millions and millions of people.
So I don't know.
Anyway,
it's a mess.
But it's good that people are thinking of post-surge tactics.
It is, and I'm a little disappointed that so few Democrats are talking about anything other than withdrawal. I mean, Joe Biden, who of course is otherwise a total klutz and joke as a presidential candidate, is at least kind of thinking that kind of stuff through. He's pro-partition. But speaking of presidential candidates, Mickey.
That's very professionally done, Bob.
Thank you. Didn't you want to talk about some?
I did. The conventional wisdom, of course, is that the Giuliani's entry puts McCain in the shade. The Giuliani, Dick Morris, who's always persuasive and always wrong, says that Giuliani is now the front runner. He even had an absurd piece, saying that it was all going to be locked up by the end of 2007, as if the election itself was going to be completely irrelevant. McCain is responding, and the rationale, just to make it clear, is that both Giuliani and McCain have problems with social conservatives because of their liberal stance, but conservatives basically want to like Giuliani, and they will bend over backwards to overlook whatever patchwork fix he applies to his abortion position and his pro-gay rights position and his pro-gun control position.
No, wait, that's whose argument?
That's John Podhoritz's argument, and also, I believe, to a certain extent, there was somebody else who had the same
there's
argument.
a related Glenn Greenwald argument on his blog.
What's that?
Well, it's that the religious right, that much of the religious right, as I understand his argument, cares as much about foreign policy as they do about the social issues, and Giuliani's got them locked up on that count. So Greenwald thinks that he's extremely formidable.
It's weird because we don't know what Giuliani's Iraq policy is, do we? In fact, I could easily see from Giuliani's experience as mayor that he would be the guy who would opt for one of these withdrawal options. And, he'd be strong enough to do it.
Well, yeah, I mean, on Iraq
McCain,
per se, you may be right, but I think general hawkishness in the Middle East is imputed to him, certainly by Greenwald, and I assume there's a certain amount of evidence for that. I mean, he points to things like, remember the way he kind of ostentatiously turned down the money from, I guess, a Saudi prince because of some remark the guy had made or something?
Well, but that's just New York politics. You can't...
Well, but I think the assumption is a certain amount of, of his New York political habits would stick with him in his foreign policy.
Right, but that's a risky. It seems like it's a risky.
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, we'll link to that.
I guess John McIntyre of Real Clear Politics also has the Giuliani beating McCain scenario, and McCain is specifically committed to the Iraq project in a way that Giuliani is not. I think, committed to the Iraq War.
Well, yeah, he's rhetorically a lot more committed.
I'm sure Giuliani is committed to that there's a war against Islamic radicals and it's all of one piece. But I don't even buy that. Anyway, McIntyre has a very smart piece where he says, how can McCain counterattack? Well, McCain can counterattack by trying to savage Giuliani on the social conservatism issues, which is risky because I don't think McCain is that right wing on these social issues that he can that it's such a strong position to attack from, and also it makes him look nasty in a way that reduces his electability. This is McIntyre's argument, which the chief appeal of McCain, since conservatives hate him on a bunch of issues like campaign finance and immigration, is that he could win. And if it looks like he's not going to win, then that sort of perversely reduces his appeal. And the other thing is economics. There was a Bob Novak column about how McCain is really the supply sider, and can portray Giuliani as more of a less of a conservative fiscally. It was wildly unconvincing. It said McCain's position was he wants to radically reduce the estate tax. Well, that's the Democratic position. The Republican position is they want to eliminate the estate tax. And if McCain doesn't want to eliminate the estate tax, I don't see how he uses tax policy as a battering ram to destroy Giuliani. I guess you could adopt some sort of Steve Forbes-like flat tax. I can't believe Republicans are as excited about that as they are by social issues and the war. But it's the only obvious card that he has to play.
You know what I think is one of the most valid grounds for skepticism about Giuliani, politics aside, is just the weird Bernard Kerik thing. I mean, remember, he I gather, got Bush to nominate Kerik as Homeland Security Director, right?
Right.
And then all this weird stuff about Kerik, who turns out to be, have a very kind of checkered past, comes out. And it's the kind of stuff that Giuliani, if he didn't know about it, that's pretty dubious, because as close as he had been to Kerik, he should know that much about the guy. It was all kind of stuff, stuff going on in Manhattan,
Right.
Anybody almost reading, between the lines and gossip pages would have known about half of it. And if he did know and nominated him anyway, that's weird.
Sorry, what's the second part?
Well, if Giuliani did know that Kerik was such a problematic character and nominated him anyway, that's weird. And the third thing is, Kerik just didn't seem that qualified to me, or competent, right? It's a very important position, Homeland Security Director. He seems to me, like... But
the Giuliani has this wonderful sort of combination of authoritarianism and compassion. The downside is that his administration was sort of run by a sort of thuggish cabal that doesn't seem ready to play on the national stage, and Kerik is one example. The other example is, he had a great police commissioner, William Bratton, who he fired basically because Bratton was getting too much publicity. He didn't like people outshining him.
Yeah, no, there was something...
And the result, you got guys replaced by sort of second-tier figures like Kerik, who weren't really, who were highly suspect. So, yes, I agree that there is that problem. The other problem is all of Giuliani's decisiveness, and he is decisive. He sometimes makes the wrong decision, and the obvious, really wrong decision he made was right after 9/11, which is his shining hour. He believes all the bogus surveys about how the air quality was fine around the World Trade Center and everybody should move back, he said, and there was nothing to worry about. It turns out that was completely wrong. The air quality was awful. It was very unsafe. And the right decision would have been to be much more circumspect about moving back.
Yeah.
And so the big decision he had to make, he sort of screwed up. I have objections to him. Every time there was a West Nile mosquito sighted anywhere in New York, he would spray the whole city with malathion, which I'm sure destroyed the West Nile virus, but malathion is not good stuff. So if you lived in New York with Giuliani, you constantly have to be prepared to flee because he was going to spray, there was going to be some truck spraying deadly insecticide coming down your street.
So we're skeptical of Giuliani.
Skeptical, but the good side is, he had this. I mean, he did A, save New York. B, he was quite creative. The most creative thing was, he has this CompStat program to have computers detect where there's crime and focus resources, and it seems to work in terms of reducing crime. And he said, hey, let's apply that to Medicaid, and let's apply that to the WIC program, the Children's Health Program, and let's figure out where the mothers aren't signing up for Medicaid, and that's sort of a brilliant idea, a brilliant left-right idea. So
we're partly skeptical of Giuliani.
We're skeptical of Giuliani, but also I could easily vote for him. So
we're skeptical with qualification.
Yes.
I could not easily vote for him, but that's okay.
Why couldn't you easily vote for him? Just because of foreign policy?
If Greenwald is right about his foreign policy, yes. That would be enough. And also, he's a dubious guy. There was something thuggish about that Carrick episode. It was like, okay, this is my boy. I want him, I want my boy to have power. The guy was not qualified. He was a creepy figure. He had a very dubious past. It was a very important national position.
It's just because Carrick had successfully sucked up to Giuliani. I think Giuliani was more duped than he was even.
Do we want a president who's easily duped?
Good point. But I think that is a risk with Giuliani. But, compared to Bush, I mean, Jesus.
Well, we are all hoping that we get improvement relative to the present administration, Mickey.
And I guess Hillary is less easily duped. And Obama seems less easily duped. Edwards seems totally dupable.
And he's a good duper, too. He's a super duper.
My main point about Hillary is there are two devastating blog arguments about destroying this idea that she's inevitable. The best is by Jonathan Chait, who that was even before this Iowa poll came out, which everybody is saying shows Hillary has surged into the lead in Iowa. Well, she surged into the lead among overall Iowa Democrats, but among people who are likely to go to the damn caucuses, she's only leading Edwards 29-25, which is just hardly an insurmountable lead. And Garrity points out that, voters are going to have to be dragged kicking and screaming into a replay of the sort of Clinton-Bush wars. I mean, that is sort of a national nightmare.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just wanted to flag those anti-Hillary posts.
Yeah, but I don't find a lot to like in Edwards either, I got to say.
Well, Edwards did this incredible thing where he went to Israel and gave a violently and violently anti-Iran speech where he basically says that it's unacceptable for Iran to have nuclear weapons. And then and it seemed just because he wanted to pander to the audience. He's just he's a trial lawyer.
Exactly. That's just what I was thinking. I mean, he plays to the jury, I think, almost at an unconscious level. I don't think he always even thinks about it.
Yeah. Well, it has to be calculated. John Judas has a post at New Republic sort of destroying him on this.
Well, I think John made the right point. I mean, what happened, the rest of the story is, and it was kind of an interesting dynamic, because, okay, he says this stuff about, he says, okay, the president should leave all options on the table. I repeat, all options on the table as far as Iran goes. In other words, the implication is I would happily bomb Iran.
Right.
Then he gets back, I didn't even know if he was there physically in Israel or it was by satellite or what, but anyway, then he's back in front of an American audience, and in fact he's being interviewed by Ezra Klein, a blogging head for the American Prospect, And, you know, he's striking a very different tone. Substantively, there's not all that much difference. I mean, he can still say, yes, of course a president should leave all options on the table.
No, substantively it was totally different because in this interview with Ezra Klein, he allows for the possibility of Iran retaining nuclear weapons, which is exactly what he ruled out when he was in Israel.
Okay, well, as I said, substantively it was totally different. And I'm glad you read it more closely than I did, because I agree with you 100% now.
I mean, I thought I thought it was incredibly embarrassing to Edwards. He basically says, you know, one thing in Israel and another thing when he's talking to an American blogger.
Yeah. And John made the right point, which is that it isn't, the question isn't which is his position. The point is neither is. Edwards is a total lightweight in foreign policy. There is no Edwards foreign policy. The guy, you know, we don't know. It's a question mark, and on those grounds alone, I would not.
He's also a mean, calculating mother. I mean, there was some doubt about what, you know, when he kept mentioning Cheney's lesbian daughter during the debate, whether it was calculated or not.
They each mentioned it.
And
Kerry and him each mentioned it. And it was so obvious and cheesy.
Right, and Edwards is just a mean guy. He's very calculating, and he'll go.
I don't mind the meanness. It was just so obvious it was ineffective. I mean, you know,
well,
it was pathetic.
He has this sort of brilliantly mean thing where he blames his vote on the Iraq War, his erroneous vote on getting bad advice from former Clinton advisors, which gets at Hillary, and say, you know, and at the same time he sort of dismisses Obama as, well, Obama made the right decision because he wasn't an insider like Edwards. It was. I guess that was not that effective. But he seems very calculating in a way that I don't think will wear well over time. It certainly isn't wearing well with me.
No, it was an interesting dynamic, though, that he made a kind of, you know, playing, you might say, more or less to the AIPAC constituency, although not to AIPAC per se. Meanwhile, Hillary was actually giving a talk to AIPAC and had her own interesting encounter. But, you know, and he said the kinds of things that would gratify that constituency. And then there was a little pushback from the kind of Netroots or something that actually forced him to walk the comments back a little. And that's a little bit of a new dynamic, I think. I mean, do you know of precedents for that?
I'm sure there are precedents, but you know, I mean, this gets to the point of the General Clark point, which is, you know, Clark made these comments about New York moneymen pushing for war with Iran, and Chait again pointed out rightly that the only anti-Semitic aspect of that was that he sort of assumed that the New York moneyman would somehow get their way, as if they were, you know, the almighty string pullers of anti-Semitic fantasy. Now, after the Iraq War, it seems to me a certain amount of paranoia about the neocon Likud lobby is justified, but there is this. The facts on the ground are such that this lobby just has nowhere near omnipotence, because the thing that it's pushing for, if it's pushing for a war with Iran, is just wildly unpopular with the grassroots. And it's just not going to be omnipotent, and there is going to be this pushback, and maybe, you know, I can't think of a situation before where the right-wing Israel lobby was lobbying for something that actually affected Americans greatly and was wildly unpopular, but that does seem to be the case now.
Yes. So you think Clark, those comments were anti-Semitic?
I thought Chait had no. I'm really reluctant to pull the anti-Semitic trigger. I think they were arguably paranoid about the power of the pro-Iran war lobby. But I think Clark is sort of flaky. But
he's definitely.
But I give him a pass for being paranoid, because after the Iraq War, people are allowed to be paranoid. And but I do think he missed. If he really thinks that we're going to Iran because there's some, you know, New York moneymen behind it, I do think he's wrong. But you know, I wouldn't. I hesitate to call that anti-Semitism, but I do think Chait is right that he had an exaggerated idea, because there's going to be pushback from people like the Netroots.
Yeah, no, Clark is definitely a funny character and not fit to be a presidential candidate because he kind of says ill-advised things like this. Yeah, I don't know. My only thought, I mean, so the kind of blogging head scorecard on that is like Jonah Goldberg and John Chait, I think, say it was evidence of anti-Semitism. Eric Alterman says no. You say no. I think, yeah, well, Matt Iglesias certainly says no. And then I have this kind of Olympian view that rises above the whole question.
As usual.
I mean, the thing that strikes me about the argument as it played out, okay, he says, you know, the people who support he says, we're going to do this because it's Jewish money, you know. People reply that's anti-Semitic. Neither side is actually addressing the merits of invading Iran or bombing Iran, right? I mean, both are ultimately, although Clark, the way his answer was couched, he wasn't necessarily questioning the motivation of the people, strictly speaking, but that's the way that rhetoric plays out, right? And it's perceived that it would be perceived that way by basically all Jews who would support bombing of Iran, right? If you say it's because of Jewish money that we're going to do it, they say you're impugning my motivation in thinking that it would be a good thing for America to do, right?
Right, they will say that.
So you're impugning their motives. They reply by impugning yours and saying you're anti-Semitic. And it just seems like it would be... I was just wondering, you know, if a ceasefire is possible where... I mean, here are my two biases on that. First of all, I agree with you on anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism and racism are charges I would only make after amassing a lot of evidence. Because they're not just saying you're a horrible person. Their practical meaning is you should be expelled from the realm of discourse, right? They're an attempt... Well, not always a conscious attempt, but their effect, when the charge is successful, it stigmatizes someone and removes them from the realm of polite society. So I think you should really have your evidence in place before you make that charge. But as for the kind of the question of the Jewish money, I also, and this is something I've learned only more slowly, that, you know, questioning people's motivations is just not usually productive, even from your own point of view. Which again, implicitly this is, when you start talking about, you know, money men in New York and stuff. So my question is, wouldn't a good ceasefire be if the left agreed to quit talking about Jewish money and its influence on politics, if the right agreed to quit throwing around charges of anti-Semitism so lightly? And I mean, not just in response to those allegations about the influence of money, but also to criticisms of Israel, which, you know, I think you'll agree, you don't have to get all that critical of Israel before you are in danger of being called anti-Semitic, right?
But so the left is still allowed to criticize Israel, just not Jewish money.
Well, I mean, you would at least, I'm talking about moving to a level where no one is talking about the other's motivations, unless there's really, really good reason or evidence for doing so. So, yeah, I mean, you would say, you know, you should only call somebody anti-Semitic if you can really back it up.
I tend to,
and you should, and meanwhile, the left should be, just talk about the merits of the policy and don't get all exercised about where the money's coming from or what the motivation is. Because after all, I mean, there's all kinds of cases where you could focus on that. If you wanted to focus on our Cuba policy and the role of Cuban Americans in Florida, you could. If you wanted to focus on the role of Polish Americans in getting NATO expanded to include Poland, you could. But
Ireland is the other one.
Ireland, right. I mean, there are a number of these things. But it just tends not to be productive.
This is a classic Bob Wright solution, which is it involves suppressing the truth, which is people have weird motives, and having a sort of polite social compact where we don't mention the truth. And it's all appearances. I favor a solution where we just let it all hang out, let everybody accuse everybody of motivations. You know, this is one where
so you favor
the anti-Semitism charge has lost its potency. So you're basically you're surrendering in the face of a weak weapon.
I was going to say, I actually think in some ways unilateral disarmament would be in the interest of both sides. Because when you start talking about Jewish money, you actually still do incur a certain amount of blowback, and it's a distraction, and you're not talking about the actual issue of what we should do with Iran. Well, and I also agree with your point that the anti-Semitism charge, because it's being used so loosely, it's losing its force. I mean, when you start saying that one of our 3 living ex-presidents is anti-Semitic, and the general who oversaw the last successful American war is anti-Semitic, I mean, you can only go so high up the hierarchy.
Well, also yeah, and I agree. I don't. I think the left should be free to talk about Jewish money, but again, they would have to substantiate their charge. First, they would have to name one of these Jewish money men. With none of these debates ever name a single person.
Right.
So let's put a face on it. Second, how could money be that important? I mean, I'm always stunned by the idea that Jewish money is that important. Eric Altman even makes a charge about Obama, that Obama refused to endorse Lamont over Lieberman and even reneged on a promise because he was so terrified of AIPAC.
Well, maybe in both cases we could...
I deny that Obama is terrified of AIPAC. If he is, he's an idiot.
Well, Mickey, at a minimum, I would at least say that both sides should do a better job of amassing actual evidence and clarifying what the nature of the charge is. But I would also say, I mean, I actually don't know that much about the way money in politics works. I'm not as close a student of political, kind of machinery as you are or a lot of other blogging heads are. But there was a Blogging Heads episode at some point in the past, and I can retrieve the dingle link if necessary, when you were trying to convince me that Bush could not do some sort of initiative I was advocating in Israel because of the power of AIPAC. And I said he's not even up for re-election anytime soon. And you said, So that was your view at that time.
I deny this. I find this dingle link. I deny it.
You challenged me to find the dingle link.
I challenge you, yes. I throw down the gauntlet. Anyway, the other interesting thing to me is the way everybody rationalizes themselves, their stance by, I'm not saying that we should choose, even if I have dual loyalties, I'm not saying we should choose Israel's interests over the United States, or we should choose Ireland's interests over the United States. I'm saying there's a confluence, that it's in Israel's interest to do what I happen to think.
Wait, that's my line. You don't like that
line?
That's
what everybody's line is.
It's true.
Because it excludes an obvious possibility, which is that there is a conflict, and at some point you have to choose between them, and at some point it's in the United States' interest to tell Israel, sorry, we know this isn't in your interest, but you got to do it anyway.
Now, well, Bill Scherer took the confluence.
Why are all these interests somehow harmonically always wonderfully in conflict?
Okay, first of all, that's not quite the claim. The claim is that, by and large, on most of the important issues, or certainly on the biggest issue of all, which is securing, Israel, bringing true, enduring national security to Israel, that is clearly in Israel's interest and clearly in America's interest, right? You would agree with that?
I agree with that, yes.
Okay, that's kind of the biggest issue. The arguments are really about how you do that. Those are the big arguments. And that's the argument between left and right, I think the Bush administration has disserved Israel's interests, pretty consistently. I think Ariel Sharon disserved Israel's interests pretty consistently. That AIPAC in supporting that has disserved Israel's interests pretty consistently. But that's really what the argument is about, because there aren't many people who deny that bringing true, enduring stability to that region, which is what true national security would entail for Israel, is in America's interest. So on the biggest issue of all, the argument is about how you do this, not in whose interest it is. And I would say largely with Iran, the same is true even. I mean, it's true that in the case of what you do about Iran, there is more of a conceivable divergence of interest, but I still think ultimately, if you can show me a strategy toward Iran that ultimately makes Israel more insecure, it's bad for America. And the argument is about what policies do that and what don't.
Well, what about a strategy that involves Iran getting a nuclear deterrent, but we trust on various mechanisms, including a revolution of governance in Iran, to make them more benign? It seems to me that does put Israel at more risk than if Iran doesn't have a bomb at all. it might well be in the interest of the United States.
If you believe that it's likely, or at least, that it's very likely at all. I don't mean like 50%, but if it's like 1% likely that Israel would launch a nuclear missile, that Iran would launch a nuclear missile, then that is a case of where there's a split between Israeli and American interests, because obviously the missile in the near term could not reach America and would be directed at Israel.
Right, whereas the terrorists who will be launched if there's a military strike against Iran's facilities will attack America.
Right, but again, I would say, first of all, that question, on which I disagree with people who think that's a likelihood, is subordinate to the larger question of how you bring security to Israel. We disagree, and that's where the disagreement begins, in this case, in our assessment of what the likelihood of that is. I personally think a more likely scenario is that the nuclear material would be used by terrorists and smuggled into some country, and that actually America is at least as likely a target of that as Israel. So it's really not in either of our interests for them to develop this, but I don't think the missile is a likely delivery system, because I don't think that the button in Iran is going to be likely in the hands of a truly suicidal person.
It's just a sort of logical preclusion of that there might be a situation where it's in our interest to say, Israel, sorry, you have to live with 3% more insecurity than you would under a solution that you would prefer. That somehow this is that there can never be a situation where somebody who has sympathy for Israel actually is working against the interests of the United States, or vice versa. That all of our solutions, the solutions that you might do are in Israel's interest, so there's no conflict. At some level of generality, of course, there's always no conflict.
I agree that Iran is a case where there is at least some appreciable divergence between American and Israeli interests, but the amount depends very much on your assessment of the situation. Under my assessment, there's not all that much difference. Under some, there is. But in any event, the larger point is that over the last decade, as this whole issue has played out about who's pro-Israel and who's anti-Israel, the fact is that every wise American has wanted Israel's enduring security, and the argument has been about how you get that. And, in addition, as Bill Scher said in talking to Eric Alterman in a recent dialogue this week, in addition, this is the rhetorically effective way to present the whole issue, but I actually think it's true that there's a really considerable convergence of interest.
But I don't know. I just don't think you can eliminate a consideration of motives.
I just don't think it's.
Why would sincere people be misguided in thinking that a different solution was in both countries' interest than the one you think? Answer: they have excessive loyalty and affection for Israel, or excessive loyalty and affection for Cuba, or excessive loyalty and affection for Ireland. I don't see how you can eliminate discussion of that.
That's one possible answer. But if that's the answer, then my perspective, given that I'm bound to think that my solution is the right one, that's the way we tend to think,
right,
would be that identity is somehow clouding their vision so that they're actually not advocating the right solution. Okay.
Well, that's fine, but you can't agree to a pact where we say we don't question motivations.
I give up on that pact. I guess it was ill-fated. But I just think it tends not to be productive to question people's motivations from your own point of view. I very slowly learned this in the course of aging because, by nature, I'm a total gutter brawler as a debater, as you know, Mickey. You can imagine what I was like in my 20s and 30s.
Well, you actually... Anyway, never mind.
I'm becoming more judicious, I know, as I age. I'm becoming more Solomonic.
Okay. Well, anyway, you've won some debates with me where you've been completely wrong.
Well, that's a tribute to my rhetorical power.
Exactly.
I revel in that. Thank you.
I agree that if you're actually debating somebody face-to-face, questioning motivations is not a...
whereas when they read it in print, they, send you a greeting card, right? Quite the opposite, if anything, I would say.
quite the opposite. You should question them to their face and be nice to them
Well,
behind
I
their back.
think conversations among ideological opposites, I think blogging heads demonstrates that they tend to be more civil when there's actual real-time verbal, oral communication.
Right, but you don't see my skillful lobbying against you behind the scenes. That's the thing.
Are you wearing a mask?
I'm not wearing a mask. No, but no. That's later in the show. But so you're saying it's never effective to question people's motivations? I just think it's.
I don't know. I was just throwing that out.
Logically, you have to do it.
Just filling time. We filled a lot of it, by the way. We should probably move on.
Okay, well, I will move on, and now I will deploy a mask. Because this guy proposed a carbon tax back in the Clinton administration.
Are we seeing the Al Gore mask?
We're seeing an Al Gore mask. And he's gloating because there was a very persuasive piece by Anne Applebaum in the Washington Post basically arguing that the Kyoto solution won't work. She argues that a solution of sort of caps and trading of carbon rights won't work because it'll be riddled with lobbying loopholes. But what will work is a carbon tax because you can go around the world basically shaming every nation into adopting this tax, and they all have an interest in doing it. They all got to tax something. They got to raise revenue somehow. Why not raise it by taxing this thing that contributes to global warming? It was, I don't pay much attention to environmental issues, but it seems a highly clarifying op-ed piece by Anne Applebaum.
Would you like an alternative perspective on that column?
Yes.
I think it's deeply flawed logically, and actually, you wouldn't expect this from a column about global warming, but I think it actually helps illuminate why. I assume she supported the Iraq War, right? I don't read her column, but I've read it a few times, and I infer that she would have supported the Iraq War, right?
I don't make that leap.
I'll bet you anything, though, right? You wouldn't bet me against it, right?
I assume
I'll give you 3-to-1 odds, and I'll bet she did. Would you take that bet? No.
No, but her husband's defense secretary of Poland, so I assume he supported the Iraq War. But
anyway, I'll tell you how this illuminates a confused support of the Iraq War. She's actually conflating two issues, okay? There's two features of Kyoto. One, yes, I guess I'll take her word that it was going to involve the fossil fuels credit trading stuff, although actually my recollection is that that's what we wanted and failed to get in it. But anyway, there's that. And then there's the fact that it is an international agreement, a supposedly binding international agreement, okay? Those are two separate features.
Right.
Now, she departs from both of them, okay? She says carbon tax is best, and then she says, and it'll be unilateral. She says, most of all, though, the successful use of carbon taxes does not require American leadership or a UN committee or a complicated international effort of any kind. It can be done country by country. Mickey, the essence of the global warming problem is that it's a free rider problem among nations, okay? If you leave nations to their own motivational systems and you don't have an international agreement, it's not rational for any one nation to focus on addressing the issue because the benefits of addressing it are spread all over the whole globe and the sacrifices you make would be confined to your nation, okay?
Right.
So it doesn't make any sense to say we don't need to do it on the international level. Now, if she's saying, as she sometimes seems to be, that a carbon tax makes sense automatically, it's in nations' interest without respect to this, well then, A, why aren't they all doing it? Why isn't it happening already?
I took her article to mean a carbon tax is actually an easier way to go about this than other mechanisms.
That is one.
You got to raise revenue somehow. Why, instead of taxing incomes and wages, as Robert Samuelson says at the end of his piece, why not tax this bad thing, carbon? And that and that the prospects of going around the world shaming people into doing this solution are better than precisely because it is simple. It's like buying a red iPod. shame all the
there
nations
are
that are
virtues
buying
to a
this
carbon
red
tax.
iPod.
I'm not denying that. But first of all, there's no reason it couldn't be part of an international agreement. And second, again, if the national logic is so compelling, I don't know why we're not seeing it happening. And I mean, back to Iraq, I mean, the point is, she's thinking, oh, let's do this on a unilateral level. Well, actually, if you think about it, you'll ask yourself, why should we sacrifice if the benefits are distributed all over the globe? And the same with the Iraq War. Even if you accept what the Bush administration was claiming about the benefits, you should have asked yourself, why should we pay all the blood and treasure? Why should we invite all the blowback if indeed the benefits will be spread globally? Okay? But she didn't ask that about Iraq, and she's not asking it now. And this is one of the most, she writes an international relations column for the Washington Post. This is one of the most fundamental questions about international relations. When does unilateral action make sense? When do you need some kind of multilateralism? And if she thinks this is some magical way of getting around that question, she should be a little explicit about it. I think she's just confused.
Well, your argument has clouded my mind about her solution, but your Iraq point is completely unnecessary. It's unnecessary for you to go on this jag. We don't even know if she was for the Iraq War. The Iraq analogy isn't a very good one.
Oh,
for
she
you.
was, I think. I think I actually remember that she was. But
why not?
No, it's a great one, Mickey.
Here you're gratuitously questioning somebody's motive after saying we shouldn't do it.
No,
in a way that completely doesn't help your argument.
No, I'm questioning her grasp of a fundamental question. And the reason it annoys me is because so much of Bush's foreign policy and his unilateralism, including Iraq, is sustained by people who don't ask themselves this question. Why should we sacrifice, if indeed there's going to be all these glorious benefits that are spread all around the world and benefit all of civilization, why should we alone sacrifice? If people had asked that question, we wouldn't be in Iraq, and we wouldn't have done about a half a dozen other ill-advised things.
I don't know.
So this is the source of my ire, but I'm not questioning her motivations.
It seems to me you have a logical, your logical argument seems persuasive, which is, if the carbon tax was so easy, why haven't we done it? But, sometimes easy solutions only become obvious when people like Ann Applebaum point them out. And we almost had a carbon tax in the Clinton administration. It seems not insane to think that we could have one today, whereas, these complicated cap and trade systems do seem, they're a little like... Bush's healthcare plan and rebuilding the Iraqi army, they seem quite complicated.
Well, economists like them. They have an efficiency argument, but I don't know how practical they are. But by the way, I mean, a global carbon tax could kind of dovetail with an emerging goal of our foreign policy, which is to, sap the strength of these oil autocracies, these oil authoritarian states. And I would point out again that that's something that is better done globally than just at the national level. Tom Friedman has a column today where he talks about the virtues, where he says that if we controlled our own oil appetite, that would insulate us from dependence on these oil states in the Middle East. That's true, and that's good, but it would be better still to sap the demand for oil broadly and get a lot of other nations in on the deal. And you could use, a global warming pact to do that. Now, it's not totally straightforward because that would also include coal, but it might be grounds for kind of biasing the deal toward oil or something. But anyway.
Well, what if? But that suggests an argument, another argument in favor of Applebaum, which is this is a case where it's easier to focus on means than ends. In other words, if every nation pledges to reduce its carbon emissions by 50% by 2030 or whatever the rule is. It's very easy for them to agree and very hard to check, and they'll welch on it. It's not going to happen. They're not meeting their targets now.
What, you're saying it's not enforceable? I didn't hear all that.
Yes. I'm saying it's easy to say every nation shall be required to impose a carbon tax of XXX, by 2010. And it's just much easier to go around browbeating nations and checking to see whether they're meeting their goals. And there's much less excuse for them to meet their goals because they're not committing to reducing carbon; they're just committing to impose this tax. And it may or may not work, but it's a more achievable international regime than the Kyoto regime.
I'm not sure that I disagree with what you said, because I'm not sure I got it entirely. But you know what?
Okay.
It's been about an hour. Do you think it would be crazy to, like, skip the fascinating Islamic Reformation section and do that next time? Or
I think Islam will still be unreformed by next week.
You think so?
Although things are moving rapidly.
So we could... we could jump to comments?
We could jump to comments.
Do you have some?
Mine isn't very good. I just wanted to... I just like this comment by... No Name about saying that doubting that doubting that the life of an army brat was really all that horrible, and I'd be surprised if Bob really came from the wrong side of the tracks in Midland, unless Midland's a lot wealthier than I have it pictured.
Oh, well, that's related to an email I had. But that's not the same one. Yours is from No Name?
Mine's from No Name.
Not the person's real name, presumably. Well, this one is from Lanky Tuesday. Not the person's real name. It says, I'm from Midland, and I'm going to have to call out Bob. I should say that, you and I were having this reverse snobbery bake-off, where
right.
I was claiming that your upbringing was more privileged than mine.
I'm from the poor side of Beverly Hills. I am from the rich side.
The wrong side of, what's that boulevard in Beverly Hills where they shop?
Rodeo? No, the Santa Monica is the dividing line.
Oh.
And they were actual tracks, so there's the wrong side of the tracks in Beverly Hills. And I'm from the wrong side of the tracks.
That must have been hard.
But I'm from the rich side of the
you
wrong
overcame
side of the
it.
tracks.
Anyway, and I had said in passing at one point, I think you mentioned the phrase wrong side of the tracks, and I said I literally lived on the wrong side of the tracks in Midland, Texas. Okay. Lanky Tuesday says, I'm from Midland, and I'm going to have to call Bob out on this one. I'm going to say it's highly unlikely Bob is from the literal wrong side of the tracks, the south side in Midland, Texas, and challenge him to prove otherwise. And by the way, the stakes are high, because he goes on to say that, if I can prove that, this will settle the Oscar Felix issue conclusively. That is, who's more like Oscar and who's more like Felix between you and me. That would steer the weight of evidence toward me being Oscar, although he then adds something suggesting it shouldn't steer the weight. But anyway, Mickey.
Yeah?
I would like to present something to the jury. Okay?
I hope it's a map.
We will get to the map. Okay? First of all, I would like to mention my mother, who was an exemplary human being. And one of the exemplary things she did was that when I was 30, she made me a quilt and gave it to me for Christmas. And it commemorated my transience. Okay? At that point, I had 21 mailing addresses. That's assuming you consolidate my different dorm rooms each year into one address. We still got 21. She made me this wonderful quilt. Okay, the first one says, it's an address in Lawton, Oklahoma. I move on to the second one, where we moved when I was 3. Okay, can we see this? It says, a little picture of a house.
Yeah?
It says 1200 South Baird Street, Midland, Texas.
Right.
Now, I will provide a link to a map of some kind that illustrates that South Baird Street is indeed to the south of the tracks. If you go up, 8, 10, 12 blocks, you'll see this kind of diagonal thing. If you look closely on some maps, it's like it says Union Pacific or something. Now, having demonstrated that, I should add that my claim actually is not that we were poor. And in fact, I don't really know, but I suspect the reason we moved to that part of Midland, this is when my dad was stationed in Korea, and it was probably because my grandmother lived nearby on South Weatherford Street. This is my suspicion. But the ultimate question that I was trying to raise last time was why you, in your heart, are a conservative and identify with the power structure, and why I, in my heart, resent entrenched privilege and tend to identify with liberals. And I do think the answer lies not actually in strictly speaking my socioeconomic status, but in the fact that we always moved around a lot. And so I was moving into each, school or whatever at the bottom of the power structure. And I was always, looking up resentfully.
So we're not allowed to mention an obvious affection for Israel as a motivation of political actors, but we are allowed to engage in this complete, indirect, crazy speculation about my motive somehow just because I didn't move around like you, that somehow I'm inherently conservative.
This explanation casts just as much doubt on my own motivations as yours. In both cases, the ideology is arrived at for non-intellectual reasons.
It's still a discussion of motivations based on flimsy. It doesn't even rise to the level of pop sociological speculation. But anyway,
I just wanted to pull that out. That was too good to pass up. I remember when my mother gave me that, my brother-in-law, Rick Ayler, said, someday you'll really appreciate that. And boy, was he right. I really appreciate it now.
I accept, but it seems to me we're both more alike than unalike. We both came from the rich side of the poor side of the tracks.
Both came from what?
Just the rich side of the poor side of the tracks. It's just one of us, the tracks were in Beverly Hills, and the other, they were in Midland.
No, this wasn't the rich side of the poor side.
No.
No, I mean, we didn't, there were like 5 kids and an Army officer's salary, so it wasn't, and again, we've made a point of moving to this neighborhood. We might have been able to do a little better had my grandmother not been living around there. But it wasn't a poor, never mind. Anyway, elsewhere in the comment front, productive exchange after the Alterman share thing between Abu Nur al-Irlandi, which may be his real name, and Blog and Noggin, which I think is not the real name of this person, that actually was, last time I checked, was illuminating the question of why some Muslims dislike America and or America's foreign policy, given the fact that, as Blog and Noggin points out, a number of our foreign interventions actually have been on the side of Muslims. That was actually making progress. The Hegelian dialectic was at work.
What was the answer?
You'd have to check into that to get clear. I think my answer would be, and I think that maybe Abu Nur would agree with this, is that when we kind of intervene audaciously somewhere in the Middle East, it's kind of natural for people to focus on that particular act and not look back into our whole history and remember that we helped the Bosnian Muslims. That's kind of human nature. Look, in the Middle East, Israel is certainly a big factor. The fact that we had troops in Saudi Arabia was an irritant to fundamentalists because the Quran does have something to say about foreign troops in the Holy Land, I think.
Those are sort of obvious answers.
Yeah, I know, and they're not even the ones that are there. I refer you to the comments section. The dialogue was still unfolding. The interesting thing was, it was like a kind of, anyway, it was productive and civil.
That is interesting. It is interesting that I once ran into somebody who claimed that the only true discussion of race relations in America was in the bar car of the Southern Crescent train after midnight. When blacks and whites would sort of finally argue with each other in civil terms. So maybe blogging heads can be that place.
No, I'm very impressed with the comment section. It turns out to be a kind of self-organizing system, I guess. I mean, comment sections generally. I was not necessarily optimistic.
Cool.
Can I say, wait, one more on this ongoing moral seminar?
Yeah.
Moral philosophy seminar. Garbage Cowboy. Not the person's real name, we think, quotes me saying, I assume that if I was born with that guy's genes and I grew up in that kind of environment, I would do what he did. And he writes, well, I have to say that logic is compelling. But my question is, if you were born with somebody else's genes and you grow up in their environment, doesn't that make you them? What else is there? Etc. And yeah, that's exactly the point. And the point is that the fallacy that actually if you do the thought experiment in a thoroughgoing way, you wind up going, of course their behavior is explicable. And the fallacy that people sometimes commit, especially when they kind of want to think uncharitably about someone who seems, hostile toward them or something, is to think that they're kind of doing the thought experiment and concluding that, no, I wouldn't do what that person did. And that thought experiment is actually not kind of doable in a way, is my point, is that of course, if you ever totally understood the forces impinging on anyone, genetic and environmental, you would understand why they did what they did. And denying that there are reasons for people to do what they did is a way to dehumanize them and reduce sympathy for them. And that's why this whole kind of root causes debate has such stakes. I mean, I think the people on the right don't want to hear about the root causes of terrorism because they're afraid that sympathy will well up for the grievances of terrorists, that you'll view them in a more charitable light. And beyond a point, that actually could in a way be a problem. In other words, if sympathy gets you to a point of not punishing people who do bad things, then that's a problem. And it's a complicated feature of human nature that can actually happen. I mean, our willingness to punish people is related to our seeing no explanation for their behavior, kind of, if you know what I mean.
I don't quite understand your argument. The right-wing position on Iraq and the Middle East is a root causes argument. It is we should address the root causes by removing these autocratic regimes and freeing up these economies to employ the army of unemployed young men. It's just an argument about what the root causes are. The right wing would deny that maybe Israel was such a root cause.
Yeah, but why is it then that the phrase root causes came to be? I mean, there are conservative commentators who react against the phrase root causes. And will say...
The neocon argument is a root cause argument.
Well, it ultimately is, but you see, they don't like the phrasing. They tend to say things, and David Brooks, well, I think you can find him doing things like this, saying, oh, all this stuff about root causes, they did it because they're morally culpable. Well, yes, as a practical matter, we have to hold people culpable for their behavior. But that doesn't mean there aren't root causes. I mean, if you're right. The fact is that every proposed solution presupposes some sort of root cause implicitly, but the right is less likely to want to talk in those terms explicitly and use phrases like root causes.
I bet you can find neocons talking about the Middle East who use the phrase root causes without, unembarrassed.
But you admit that the reaction against that phrase has tended to come from the right, right?
Oh, sure, but I deny it's been especially virulent lately because they've embraced it, and it doesn't. And arguing your argument about free will or something doesn't seem to help all that much.
This is an excellent place to leave this because the ongoing moral philosophy seminar in our comment section can bring further clarity. You raise an interesting question, but
I certainly can't.
There's definitely an ideological asymmetry in terms of how comfortable people are using that phrase, and it's a funny. And I do think people like Brooks sometimes say what I said, but we will continue this.
Cool. Anyway, we've gone on an incredibly long time.
We have, but when your Facebook following is increasing at this rate, I just think the public probably can't get enough.
And when Blogging Heads is expanding so rapidly, soon everybody in Facebook will actually
be on Blogging Heads.
Be on Blogging Heads.
They are the talent.
24/7.
Oh, quickly, speaking of which, so far all known submissions to our op-ed contest have violated the rules. I will link again to the page that has the rules.
How have they violated the rules?
Well, I ask that fundamentally the thing just be kind of you on camera. Not to say you couldn't edit in footage if you want, but that's not what it's about.
I see, okay.
And also there are time limitations. I think I said between a minute and 2.5. Anyway, that's all on the page. The other thing is, on the jobs issue, I'll put that link up again. The applicants have tended to favor the editorial-type positions. So those of you who are looking for a production-type position, boy, are you in luck. Doesn't pay well, but the spiritual rewards are great. So I'll put that link up again. And for that matter, if you feel like being a latecomer to the editorial position job pool, don't let me discourage you.
What about your Swedish assistant?
My what?
The Swedish assistant to serve you coffee while you're doing all this Blogging Heads work.
You mean Svetlana?
Aren't you spending some of the money on that? I guess not.
Svetlana's not a Swedish name, is it? Is that Russian or what?
It's not Swedish. I don't know.
I think it's anyway, Russian. I'm not sure what you're talking about, but thanks for sharing that.
Okay, I'm just trying to imply that you're blowing Bob Rosenkranz's money on frivolous amenities.
Oh, that's what I do for a living, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, I've got to go catch a first-class flight right now, a transatlantic flight.
Yeah. Cool.
Be back in 24 hours.
Okay.
All right.
See you later.
See you around.